this early morning. The sky over Jerusalem still bears the dark weight of night, but the streets are already coming alive. You are standing in a city that never fully sleeps, especially not at this time of year. The cool air of the Mediterranean spring brushes your face as you walk down a narrow limestone alley, and the scent coming from all directions is an impossible mixture to separate. Wood smoke, spices, human sweat, and something animal, warm and alive. Sheep, thousands of them. You are in Jerusalem in the year 33 AD, and the city is about to burst. Not with violence, not yet, but with people. It is estimated that at this time of year, Jerusalem's population, normally between 50 and 80,000 inhabitants, would triple or even quadruple during the Jewish Passover festival, Pesach. Pilgrims from all parts of the Mediterranean world would come on foot, on donkeys, in caravans, crossing deserts and mountains for entire weeks to be here, in this city, during this specific week. Galileans from the north, Jews from Babylon, merchants from Egypt, entire families from Syria, all with a single destination, the temple. But what exactly happened here? What did these people do, eat, feel, fear? What was it like to experience Passover in Jerusalem in the same year that, according to the Gospels, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified and resurrected? The answer will surprise you, because the biblical Passover was nothing like what most of us imagine today. Forget for a moment the gentle images of Renaissance paintings, the serene tables with golden goblets and bread on white cloths. What was happening in Jerusalem that week was something radically more raw, more physical, more disturbing, and at the same time, more deeply human than any artistic representation has ever managed to capture. It was a festival of memory and blood, of liberation and sacrifice, of collective joy and individual fear. It was all of this at the same time. Let's start at the beginning, which actually begins long before you arrive in the city. If you were a Jewish pilgrim coming from Galilee, the region where Jesus and most of his disciples were from, you would have walked about 140 kilometers on foot. 3, 4, or often sometimes even 5 days of walking continuously. You would carry on your back or on an animal a bundle with provisions, extra clothes, and most likely a lamb. A young, male, unblemished lamb that you would have carefully chosen 10 days before the festival, exactly as the law of Moses prescribed in the book of Exodus. This animal would walk by your side, sleep near you, and eat from what you had. And then, on the afternoon of the 14th day of the month of Nisan, you would hand it over to the priest to be sacrificed. Think about that for a moment. 10 days with an animal you chose yourself. 10 days looking at it, taking care of it. And then, the giving up. This was not insensitivity. It was the opposite. It was the central point of the festival, the awareness of the cost of freedom. The living memory that, on the last night in Egypt, more than 1,000 years before that moment, each Hebrew family had painted the doorposts of their house with the blood of a lamb, so that the angel of death would pass over. Passover was not an abstract celebration. It was an annual reenactment of survival, and the city knew it. As you approached Jerusalem in the last kilometers of the road, something visual struck you with force. The city walls gleaming in the afternoon sun, built from white limestone, which the Romans called Meleki. And at the center of it all, dominating the horizon with an almost impossible-to-ignore presence, Herod's temple. Not the small and humble temple that many imagine. An architectural complex that even the Romans themselves considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. Some of its exterior stones measured over 12 meters in length and weighed hundreds of tons. The main facade was covered in gold, and on a clear morning, when the sun rose over the Mount of Olives to the east, the reflection was so intense that, according to the historian Flavius Josephus, anyone who tried to look directly at it had to turn their eyes away, as if staring at the sun. You would arrive in this city carrying a lamb, and the city would return this image to you. Inside the walls, the organized chaos of a metropolis in celebration took over every inch. In the streets of the lower market, merchants sold everything a pilgrim needed: olive oil, bitter herbs like horseradish and wild endive, unleavened flour for bread, wine. There were money changers on every corner, because the temple tax had to be paid in a specific currency, the Tyrian shekel. And those coming from outside brought Roman denarii or Greek drachmas that needed to be exchanged. This was exactly the scene described in the Gospels when Jesus enters the temple and overturns the tables of the money changers just days before his death. What seems like an isolated act of anger was, in fact, a gesture against the economic heart of the entire festival. But there was something even more striking waiting for you in the temple courtyard. You pass through the gate and enter the outer courtyard of the temple, the so-called Court of the Gentiles, and what your senses take in all at once is almost overwhelming. Sound, smell, movement. Hundreds of priests dressed in white move with absolute precision among marble pillars. Levites sing psalms aloud, the so-called Hallel, which are Psalms 113 to 118, and the sound of their voices echoes off the stone walls and rises into the hot afternoon air. There were harps, flutes, silver trumpets. It was music, but music with a quality you had never heard anywhere else in the world, because nowhere else in the world was like this place. And there was blood. Not metaphorically. On the 14th day of Nisan, between mid-afternoon and sunset, the priests sacrificed the lambs brought by the pilgrims in a ritual that Flavius Josephus describes with almost disturbing precision. According to him, in the year 70 after Christ, shortly before the destruction of the temple, more than 256,500 lambs were counted as sacrificed in a single Passover. Even if that number is exaggerated, as some historians suspect, the scale was colossal. The priests worked in 3 shifts, with groups taking turns while others left. The blood was collected in golden and silver basins, passed from hand to hand in a human chain to the central altar, where it was poured out at the base. There were stone channels beneath the courtyard built specifically to drain the blood down to the Kidron Valley below. This is what was happening in the very courtyard where, days earlier, Jesus had taught the crowds. In the same temple where, according to Luke, he had been presented as a baby decades earlier. Passover was not the backdrop of the story. Passover was the story. And now comes the part that changes everything. Think about how Jesus' disciples were feeling that week. They were Galileans, countrymen, fishermen, and craftsmen who had arrived in Jerusalem along with the crowd of pilgrims. For most of them, it was probably one of the few times in their lives they had been to the capital. The city was bigger, noisier, more Roman, and more intimidating than anything they had ever known. And their master had just made a public entrance that shook the entire city. The entry into Jerusalem on a little donkey, which all 4 Gospels describe, was not a humble and unnoticed gesture as it is sometimes portrayed. It was a calculated political and religious statement, because the prophet Zechariah had written centuries earlier that the king of Israel would enter Jerusalem riding on a donkey, gentle and bringing salvation. Anyone who knew the scriptures, and in Jerusalem, during Passover, practically everyone did, immediately understood what that meant. The crowd spread cloaks on the ground and waved palm branches, a gesture in Jewish culture reserved for kings and liberators. They shouted Hosanna, which literally means save now, a word loaded with political and messianic expectation. The Roman soldiers stationed at the Antonia fortress, which was strategically built high above the temple courtyard so that the soldiers could observe everything from above and intervene quickly in case of unrest, especially during Passover, when the risk of revolt was highest, looked down and saw all of this happening. And they took note. Rome had a relationship with the Jewish Passover that was pure calculated tension. The Roman governor usually lived in Caesarea Maritima, by the sea, but during Passover he would move to Jerusalem. Not out of devotion, but out of precaution. Pontius Pilate, the governor in the year 33, followed this same pattern. He was in the city. His soldiers were in the city, and they knew that the festival the Jews celebrated was precisely a festival of liberation from the oppression of a foreign empire. Egypt was the past. Rome was the present. This analogy was lost on no one. It is in this context that Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples needs to be understood. The meal we know as the Last Supper was a Seder, the ritual meal of Passover. And the Seder had a millennia-old structure, a script that every Jewish family followed to the letter. There were 4 cups of wine, each representing one of the 4 promises of liberation that God had made to the people in Egypt, according to the book of Exodus. There was the unleavened bread, matzah, a symbol of the haste of the escape, because there was no time to wait for the bread to rise. There were the bitter herbs, maror, to remember the bitterness of slavery. There was the charoseh, a paste of fruits and nuts that represented the clay the Hebrews used to build the cities of Egypt with their own hands. And there was the lamb, which in that context was the center of everything. The head of the family or the leader of the table would conduct the ritual by answering the questions of the youngest child. The question was always the same, and Jews still ask it today. Why is this night different from all other nights? And the answer was the entire narrative of the Exodus, told again, lived again, felt again. Jesus was doing exactly that with his 12 disciples, but on that particular night, he changed the script. When the 3rd cup of wine came, the so-called cup of redemption, he spoke words that none of those present had ever heard before. He took the unleavened bread and said it was his body. He raised the cup and said it was his blood, the blood of a new covenant. For men who had spent their entire lives hearing that the blood of the Passover lamb was the sign of deliverance, to hear their master reposition that symbolism in reference to himself was something that words can hardly describe. It was confusing, it was frightening, it was impossible to fully comprehend at that moment. And then Judas departed from the dinner table, and the night slowly started to drift towards something that not a single person present there could yet fully comprehend or clearly see. The night from Thursday to Friday, in that year 33, was the longest that Jesus' disciples had ever experienced. After the supper, they left through the city gate and went down to the Kidron Valley, then climbed up to the Mount of Olives, to a place called Gethsemane, which in Aramaic means oil press. It was a garden with ancient olive trees, twisted by time, and it was a place that Jesus visited regularly, which means that Judas knew exactly where to find him. You need to picture this moment carefully to understand the weight of what was happening. It was a night of a full moon. The Jewish calendar is lunar, and Passover always begins on the full moon of the month of Nisan, which means that the Garden of Gethsemane was bathed in a pale, cold light that cast the shadows of the olive trees onto the earth like figures lying down. Jesus moved away from the disciples and went to pray. The Gospels describe that his sweat fell like drops of blood, a condition that modern medicine identifies as hematidrosis, a real phenomenon that can occur in states of extreme anguish, when the capillaries surrounding the sweat glands rupture under intense emotional pressure. He knew what was coming and chose to stay. When the soldiers arrived with Judas, carrying torches and spears, their number was considerable. John mentions a cohort, which technically would be about 600 men, although many scholars believe the term was used more loosely to indicate a significant detachment. The fact is that Jesus' arrest was not discreet. It was a nighttime security operation, coordinated between the temple authorities and the Roman garrison, right at the peak of the most sensitive week of the year, when Jerusalem was packed with pilgrims and any spark could ignite a fire. Peter drew a sword and cut off the ear of one of the high priest's servants. Jesus touched it and restored it, and then surrendered himself. The trial that followed, or rather, the trials, because there were several in quick succession, is one of the most studied events in ancient legal history. First, before Annas, the former high priest, who still held enormous political power. Then before Caiaphas, the acting high priest, where the Sanhedrin was convened while it was still early morning, which in itself was a serious irregularity according to Jewish law, which forbade nighttime trials in capital cases. Then before Pilate, who sent him to Herod Antipas, ruler of Galilee, who happened to also be in Jerusalem for Passover, and who sent him back to Pilate. All of this happened between dawn and morning. This frantic pace was not accidental. It was a deliberate urgency. The religious leaders who wanted Jesus' death knew they had a narrow window. If the execution did not take place before the official start of Passover, before sunset on that Friday, it would have to wait. And waiting meant time for the crowd of pilgrims who worshipped Jesus as a prophet to react. Time for a riot. Time for Rome to intervene in unpredictable ways. Pilate hesitated. The Gospels are consistent on this point. He tried to escape the problem by using the custom of releasing a prisoner during Passover, offering the choice between Jesus and Barabbas, who is described as an insurgent and a murderer. The crowd chose Barabbas. This is where the narrative requires us to pause for a moment and resist the temptation to romanticize. The crowd that shouted Hosanna at the triumphal entry a few days earlier was made up mostly of Galilean pilgrims who had come with Jesus or because of Jesus. The crowd in front of Pilate's praetorium that morning was different. It was summoned, it was local, and it was influenced by the religious leaders who had the power and means to quickly mobilize their supporters. It was not the same group that changed its mind. It was another group, in another place, at another time. The story is more complex than the simplified narrative of a fickle crowd. The crucifixion took place at a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull, outside the city walls. Death by crucifixion was the Roman punishment for slaves and non-Roman criminals, specifically designed to be slow, public, and humiliating. It was a permanent warning set up along the roads and on the outskirts of cities. This is how Rome treats those who defy it. For the disciples, seeing their master die in this way was not only emotionally devastating, it was theologically unsettling, because in Jewish tradition, someone hanged on a tree was considered cursed by God. Paul of Tarsus, years later, would cite exactly this verse from Deuteronomy when trying to explain the meaning of Jesus' death. And then the third day arrived. What the Gospels describe on Sunday morning is a scene of confusion gradually turning into astonishment. The women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, and others, arrived at the tomb with aromatic spices to complete the anointing of the body, because on the previous Friday, there had not been enough time before the start of the Sabbath. They arrived expecting to find a corpse. They found a stone rolled away and an empty tomb. The resurrection, regardless of how each reader interprets it, whether as a literal historical event, a transformative spiritual experience, or a profound theological narrative, changed the world in a way that very few events in human history have ever matched. In less than 3 centuries, the faith born during that Passover week in Jerusalem had spread throughout the Roman Empire, reaching Africa, Asia, and the borders of India. A message born in an olive garden, illuminated by the full moon, at the height of a liberation festival with 2,000 years of history, carried by men and women who were mostly poor, without political power, without armies. It has reached you at this very moment, 2,000 years later. Think about that distance. Think about that persistence. What the biblical Passover teaches us, when looked at with open and honest eyes, goes far beyond religion. It speaks to us about collective memory as a tool for survival, about how peoples who go through oppression create rituals so they do not forget where they came from and where they want to go, about how a simple meal, unleavened bread, bitter herbs, a cup of wine, can carry the weight of an entire identity for millennia, about how narratives of liberation have a power of resonance that transcends culture, language, and era. And it teaches us something subtler, more unsettling, and more necessary. That the moments which change history rarely seem monumental while they are happening. For those who were in Jerusalem that week, there was a noisy festival, a regional preacher being executed, Roman soldiers keeping order, pilgrims returning home with their burdens on their backs, and the memory of the lamb they had brought. Everyday life went on. History was being made in silence, in gardens, in tombs, in whispered conversations among frightened fishermen trying to make sense of what they had seen. You and I are always inside moments that we don't yet know how to name. Always inside a week that, for someone in the future, might be the point when everything changed. If this documentary touched you in any way, leave your comment down below. Write about what surprised you most in this story. Like the video so more people can discover this content, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next documentaries. And if you want to continue this journey through the ancient world, watch our video now about what daily life was like in Jerusalem during Roman times. You won't be able to stop halfway through.